You know how much the human population has exploded over the last few centuries, and especially over the last couple of decades. We've gone from around 1 billion people in 1800 to over 7.5 billion people alive today. For most of my life, I held an assumption that I think is quite common, that the human population has increased so dramatically that more than half of the people who have ever lived are alive today. In the 1970s, a rumor arose, and I still encounter people who think this way, that fully 75% of people who have ever lived are alive today. Have a look at this chart of population growth. Part of this idea is true. We see tremendous growth in the population since the 1 billion mark was reached around 1800. Over the course of the last century, the population has risen from 2 billion in 1927 to 7.5 billion today. At the risk of tormenting those of you who don't like math and graphs, let me impress upon you some of the sheer numbers. Another way to look at this is how long it took for the population to double at various times in history. It took 697 years for the population to double from 250 million in 837 CE to 500 million in 1543. And it took 260 years to double from 1543 to 1803. 125 years to double from 1803 to the year 1928. And then it took only another 47 years to double from 2 billion in 1928 to 4 billion in 1975. Or looked at another way, consider the number of years it took to add 1 billion people to the population, which was basically from time immemorial to 1803 for the first billion, and another 125 years for the second billion, and then for the last 3 billion, each 1 billion was added in a mere 12 years. So given the huge increase in the human population, I was prepared to see a very high percentage of the human population alive today. Then I looked at the best estimates, and I realized just how wrong that intuition was. I was able to find plausible estimates going back to the early 1960s. I don't think it's worth getting into the assumptions of these various estimates because they all agree within a reasonable margin of error. The papers are detailed in the description. The most widely used and reputable analysis today comes from the Population Reference Bureau, the PRB, a Washington-based research group using much of the work of the demographer Carl Haub. Recently, they put out the number of 108 billion, which given the current world population of 7.5 billion means that about 7% of all people who have ever lived are alive today. So I realized that my intuition of a large percentage of humans who have ever lived being alive today was just plain wrong. I'm going to quickly run through several exciting and entirely incorrect errors that I went through trying to make sense of this. First, I thought, wait, the dating of human origins has recently been pushed back in history. These researchers were using 50,000 years as an origin point for Homo sapiens, but recent research has pushed that date back to maybe 300,000 years. See my video on modern human origins in Africa for more information on this. So maybe the number that have ever lived is actually larger. Those several 100,000 years slowly add up. But no, early human populations are thought to have been small and spread out, and they don't really add much to these numbers at all. So much for my original contribution. Then I thought, okay, we start at 74,000 years ago, the date of the Toba volcanic supereruption that has been believed to have wiped out a large percentage of human beings alive at the time. There's a concept called the Toba bottleneck, wherein it postulates that maybe only 10,000 people were left alive after this Toba incident. But no, this conjecture has recently been pretty definitively ruled out, and Toba is no longer thought to have been this dramatic bottleneck. Okay, fine. So pushing back Homo sapiens dates doesn't matter. What about considering the numbers of Neanderthals and Denisovans with whom we interbred? Doesn't help either. Small population sizes. In fact, these PRB estimates start arbitrarily at 50,000 years ago with the number 2 people, as just an arbitrary starting point for calculation purposes. And it arrives at 8,000 BCE with a world population of 5 million and a little over 1 billion people at that time having ever lived. That's 42,000 years from 50,000 years ago to 8,000 BCE. A long time and many generations even for a small population. And 8,000 years is a shorter time still. But from 8,000 BCE to 1 CE, 47 billion people are born. Fully 44% of all humans who were ever born were born between 8,000 BCE and 1 CE. Wow. With the small world population at that time, I wouldn't have thought that. That's pretty fascinating. Over time thereafter, there are slowdowns for plagues and famines. For instance, the Black Death of the 1300s may actually have started in the 500s, killing over half the population of the Byzantine Empire, and overall killing hundreds of millions of people, measurably slowing the growth of human population. But by 1650, we get to 86 billion people who have ever lived. And get this, the tremendous increase in population, which took the world population from 1.5 billion in 1900 to 7.5 billion people today, only added a total of 12 billion human beings who have ever lived. The 20th century added a lot of humans, but over a very short number of years compared to the long span of human history. I imagine someone wondering why I'm talking about this. Why is this question interesting? First and foremost, just because it's an interesting historical fact that surprises. For most people hearing this for the first time, there are way more people in all of history than one would have thought. That's interesting on its own. But more than that, this is interesting because it flies in the face of our intuitions, because it shines a light on one of our cognitive biases. It demonstrates once more how we tend to assess the world based on recency, based on personal experience, and based on expectations. The fact that the population has exploded is easier for us to wrap our minds around than the effect of thousands and thousands of years of births and deaths. We just don't assess things that way. Just like we have trouble with the concept of deep time, like the Earth having been around for 4.5 billion years and human beings having occupied it for just a minute fraction of that time. Where else does this lead? What are we missing in these cognitive biases? Do we privilege the recent in other ways? Dismiss history? Refuse to consider what we might learn from a past that doesn't look like the present? I think the answer is a resounding yes. For example, in what might seem like a non sequitur, when we contemplate an Earth running up against changes that haven't been seen here for hundreds of thousands of years. See this chart of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, for example. What possibilities and outcomes will we fail to consider if we only look at recent history? And one cannot help but think about the population trend. Where is it going? The rate of growth has slowed in recent decades, but will it stabilize, as many demographers believe? Can we achieve a stable population? And will that be at 10 billion? Or 50 billion, as the consequences for straining the Earth's resources are likely to be very different. Is there a number for the carrying capacity of the Earth? If so, what assumptions underlie such a number? What are the constraints? How much consumption? What about energy usage? Heating of the Earth? Melting of the polar ice caps? Arable land? Inhabitable land? I hope to explore many of these fascinating and critical questions in future videos, so please stay tuned. In the meantime, think about 7% of all people who have ever lived being alive today. 7% alive today with humans having been around for several 100,000 years. When you're expecting a number like 50%, 7% seems like a small number. But on its own, 7% of all humans who have ever lived being alive today reflects enormous growth. It's not really such a small number after all. My hope for the planet and for humankind is that that percentage continues to drop. If so, the planet will thank us. Be sure to subscribe. You can follow my Instagram, and thanks a lot for watching.